How do you learn? Through listening? Maybe through doing? Or through reading and writing? Personally, I learn best when I'm teaching and talking and eating and reflecting and swallowing and responding and... Oh, wait a minute. Aren't I just describing being a human being in the world? Quick, cut to the music. Welcome to Digesting Food Studies, the podcast that swims in the soup of big ideas that make up the deliciously expanding field of learning and knowing and doing that we call food studies. I'm your host, David Szanto. This episode is for everyone who wants to understand food systems and then take on-the-ground action, building bridges between classrooms, fields, conference rooms, and kitchens. On today's show, we're talking about food pedagogies, that is, the ways that we have learned to help others learn about the deepest relationships we humans have. With food, of course. We're drawing on Volume 8, Issue 4 of Canadian Food Studies, and its thematic focus on food pedagogies in Canada. First off, Alexia Moyer and I talk about schoolyards as food learning spaces, an Amuse Bouche segment that might take some of you back to your own childhoods. Did you have serviceberry bushes in your learning environment as a kid? Then I talk with Jennifer Sumner and Michael Classens, who guest edited the Pedagogies issue of CFS. As two of the leaders in critical food pedagogies in Canada, they share some compelling insights about the opportunities, the challenges, conundrums, and delights involved in teaching about food, including the pleasure of eating your students' assignments. Coming in with the aftertaste, secondary school teacher and graduate school learner Eric Schofield gives us his take on food literacy and its intersections with pedagogy more generally. So today, as we digest some ideas about teaching about food studies, so food pedagogies, we're going to think about all the different ways that food can be taught. And food as a system requires systemic thinking in terms of teaching. What's your experience with teaching, Alexia? What have you taught before, or what have you been taught?
I was a ballet teacher for a very long time.
Wow.
And so I taught the little ones to the big ones on point. And I also taught at university, a course on Canadian culture.
A small focused discipline.
As we'll be talking about today, you can teach food in the classroom, but you can also move the class outside.
Yes, the world is our teacher, and sometimes lived experience is a better way to learn than through books and words and PowerPoint slides.
Yes, particularly when it comes to food. It's not quite the same on a piece of paper.
So tell us about the world as our classroom.
Today we're going to be looking at schoolyards as learning landscapes. So I'm going to take you back to the 1980s briefly and give you a brief description of my elementary schoolyard as a point of comparison.
Okay.
So I want you to imagine a rectangle, the perimeter of which was defined by a 12-foot tall chain link fence. Mm-hmm. Or at least it seems that tall when you're 9. And there was a baseball diamond in the lower left corner. There were 3 play modules, a jungle gym, a steel dinosaur, which was a particular favorite of mine, and a slide fort platform structure. Close to and surrounding the school was a dirt mound on which no grass grew. There were 2 trees around which one might play cops and robbers, for instance, and the trees being the safety zone and actually providing the only shade to the yard.
Yes, I think I had a school playground like that too. Death traps, actually, because it was all built on asphalt, so we were going to fall off that steel dinosaur and crack our heads open.
Now, I'm still walking around with scars, but yes, I mean, we survived the experience. They're not terribly aesthetically pleasing places. On the one hand, you could say that it's an open blank space that invites unstructured play.
Sure.
But I'd like to now take you to another public elementary school in my present-day neighborhood. In the front yard, there are perennials, hostas, lilies, peonies, and a couple of wildflower meadows. In the courtyard out back, there are a number of amélanchier or amelanchier or serviceberry trees that provide shade as well as a snack in season. There are bees on the roof. There is a compost bin, which the children actively turn over. And the newest addition is a forêt nourricière, or edible forest garden.
Wow. Not the asphalt jungle of our childhood.
No, I mean, here we have planting that consists of trees and shrubs and perennials, and it's more serviceberry, strawberries, thyme, mint, rhubarb, raspberry bushes.
So can I hazard a guess that this is your kids' playground?
It is indeed. So I get to go every day.
Lucky them.
Well, yeah. And in fact, the plants were chosen by the children who were then invited to participate in the planting of them. And as time goes on, they will help to maintain the garden and harvest its offerings.
So this is, as you're describing it, an education space.
It is. And now it's interesting because these two schools are separated by 30-something years and a province. One is in the separate or Catholic school board in Ontario versus an alternative French language public elementary school in Quebec. So we're talking about a very small sample here. Mm-hmm. And I think you can guess what my own preference is. But versions of the schoolyard 1 and 2 exist side by side in my neighborhood. But what this second schoolyard tells us is that there is a shift in thinking about a school-adjacent outdoor space, that it can be a learning landscape, as Ann Taylor writes, a three-dimensional textbook, an outdoor classroom. So Taylor is a professor at the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of New Mexico. And among other things, she wrote a book called Linking Architecture and Education, Sustainable Design for Learning Environments. So she's particularly invested in this idea that design and architectural forms can evolve out of curriculum and learning theory. The environment in which one learns is just that. It is not a neutral space and can invite engagement. It's not just a box.
Right. And it's not outside of the school. I mean, it is outside of the school, but it's not separate from the school experience. It is a continuation of it. It is an extension. It is in the larger circle in which the school is embedded.
Yeah. And the children at the school are invited to participate in the making of the space. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So they're not simply passive recipients. They're not simply passing through, but they're planting, they're watering, they're raking, they're picking, they're eating their way through the school property. So there are structural forces at work here. Funding for this edible forest was provided by the City of Montreal's 25 financial contributions program for ecological transition. So the question is, what will become of this forest? Well, the Forêt Nourricière was just installed last week. So it's so new, the identification tags are still attached to the plants. So it'll be interesting to see beyond the initial planting, what kind of programming could develop around it. And students and teachers may also ask questions about what this work on this small patch of land means in a broader context.
Well, it's going to raise a lot of questions about, because this is always the problem with a school garden of any sort, is what happens in the summer when the students are not there, or when the caretaker or the driving force or the spark plug suddenly is not available or is on parental leave or gets fired for some reason.
And the benefits of a forêt nourricière is that essentially it's supposed to take care of itself over time. There is some input, obviously, from gardeners, but it's one that is supposed to require less in the way of watering and maintenance. Okay. And so the three layers, the planting layer, the shrub layer, and the smaller plants underneath are supposed to sort of help each other and work together.
Like in agroforestry situations that are meant to be less human input intensive.
Yes.
It's going to be a whole new wave of kids coming out of the school who maybe when they get to high school, when they get to university, thinking about on-campus gardens and farms, thinking about learning outside the classroom. I know Michael Classens, one of our guests today, is very dedicated to non-classroom-based learning. And particularly when it comes to food, this is brilliant. And when you're teaching about food systems, of course, there are many, many things that can be better taught in the actual context of growing.
And what better way to learn about dirt than to play in it?
Yes. Well, thanks so much. I hope your kids get really dirty.
They do.
Excellent. Michael Classens is an assistant professor in the teaching stream of the School of the Environment at the University of Toronto. Previously, he taught in Trent University's Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems program, and he regularly publishes on sustainability, racial justice, and critical food systems pedagogy. Jennifer Sumner is, as you'll hear from Michael, one of the first people to conceive of and teach about critical food pedagogies in Canada, and she's a leading light in the field. She's an associate professor in the Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Education at OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Jennifer, Michael, thank you so much for coming to talk to us about food pedagogies and particularly the issue of Canadian food studies that you guest edited on that theme. It's wonderful to have you here.
Yeah, really great to be here. Thanks for the invitation, David.
Thank you for inviting us.
We published this issue all the way back in 2021. There was, at that time, as I seem to recall, a kind of growing interest in not just food studies, but thinking about how we teach food studies, how we teach about food more broadly. But what was it that brought the two of you to be interested in guest editing an issue of the journal?
Maybe I'll jump in first. At least from my perspective, part of the motivation for wanting to do this is because Jennifer, of course, is, someone who kind of invented critical food systems pedagogy, taught a course in, I think, 2011. I think it was the first food pedagogy course, at least in North America, maybe the world. And so part of the motivation for me to work with Jennifer was just to sort of work with someone who has, really been a leader in this field since its very inception. In fact, sort of co-founded the field. And then I guess kind of secondarily, it's kind of emerges as an interest for me anyway, because it brings together two fields that are, I think, fundamentally interested in questions of power and how to reshape and resist and transform those things. So critical food studies on the one hand and critical pedagogy on the other hand. And so bringing these two things together, I find there's a real alchemy that kind of results from that.
And food activism had been part of your past. This is part of what you believed in from the beginning within food studies.
Exactly. And I think, again, those things are sort of inherently embedded in critical food studies and critical pedagogy, right? People like, Paulo Freire and bell hooks and others that tie movement making to education. So bringing these two things together, I just think results in some really particularly useful tools for thinking about and theorizing and acting for change.
And Jennifer, so going back to 2011 and presumably before that, how did food pedagogy become something that you cared about and became such a leader in that someone like Michael wanted to desperately work with you on editing a journal issue?
Well, I was teaching at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education and in the Adult Education and Community Development program there. So certainly I was working in the area of education and learning and teaching, and especially not well beyond classroom teaching, because adult education is sort of lifelong and life-wide, so it really gets into all sorts of ways people learn. But from my PhD work, I had worked in, on the concept of sustainability, and then I worked with organic farmers and looked at their contributions to sustainable communities. And from there, I started looking at organic food and then looking at food in general. And I just found it endlessly fascinating. And in some ways, when I started working in food and thinking about food and writing about food, there were two solitudes. I was doing education and I was doing, my interest in food. Finally, I started pulling the two together. There is so much. Whatever course I was teaching, 4, 5, 6 students would write a paper about food and the topic of the course. And I thought, there's really something in this that pulling these things together. And so I thought, I need to do a course about food and learning and, bring the educational side in because I'm at OISE and bring the food side in. And just out of the blue, the pedagogy of food as a title for the course dropped out of the sky into my lap. And I thought, this is great. This will work. And indeed, the class is always full and they never stop talking.
Yeah, as food people are wont to do, it seems. As we know, food systems are kind of everything in the world. Food and human relationships are the most important relationships that we've got going. We tend to forget about them because food is so everyday, so mundane, and yet it's also the most spectacular and important thing that humans do. But when we look at this issue, it also reveals to us exactly how far-reaching food and learning, broadly speaking, can go. So we've got articles on food literacy, on Indigenous food knowledge and teaching about food to Indigenous youth, on food in schools. Very important these days as the National School Food Program continues to roll along. We've got the story of creating a food studies BA at George Brown College, about decolonization, about community-engaged learning, about intergenerational pedagogies. It just goes on and on and on. And it's such a rich issue because there are so many different perspectives. What is it that makes teaching about food so distinctive? We bump into challenges, but we also have incredible opportunities in our food courses. Why is that, in your opinion?
Yeah. So it was Tony Winston who referred to food as the intimate commodity. So owing to the fact that it's something that is in some ways kind of invisible, that we just kind of interact with, those of us who are lucky enough to get to eat, 3 square meals a day, just sort of mindlessly interact with it. But on the other hand, it is just kind of fundamental, literal biophysical survival, but also culturally relevant. Like food is just this really kind of confounding thing, which makes it a really compelling, material object, cultural object, political object to engage with in the class. And I think all of us have some sense that it's extremely compelling to students. Students, really want to engage with food. And I think part of the reason why that is as well is because I think people who teach food, and of course many in the of the articles in the issue speak to this, demonstrate the ways in which food is implicated in structuring power in society. And it becomes both a way to look at structural issues of power, so racialization, gender, etc., but also a way to sort of confront and try to change those things. And so I think that that's a really sort of powerful tool in teaching food, is the ability to kind of highlight how power is inequitable and then think about and theorize and act on how to then sort of make change.
Maybe that's the incredible opportunity. Jennifer, maybe I'll repose the question. Do you find that there are specific challenges that come with teaching about something as vast and intimate as food?
I think there are some challenges in the sense that because everybody's familiar with eating and hopefully everybody, gets to eat every day. In some ways, everybody's an expert. Mm-hmm. And so it sometimes can become a little difficult to persuade people to think differently about food because they are already, very well embedded in their ways of thinking about food. But I find that I'm really guided by a quote, certainly from my teaching in the Pedagogy of Food course, a quote from Flowers and Swan that say that food is not only an object of learning, but it's also a vehicle for learning. Mm-hmm. And so it's not only that you learn about food itself, but it's an entree into those bigger issues like Michael was talking about, like power. It might be really hard to talk to students about power, but if you can do it through food, it's just much easier. Talking about gender issues, talking about globalization issues, sustainability issues, you can do it through food. Yeah. And that really oils the wheels to some extent to discussions that people can see that. I think also it might be difficult because you do get different people from different disciplines. I get people from around the campus at University of Toronto taking my Pedagogy of Food class, and they come in with their own disciplinary perspectives. Food studies is so interdisciplinary, and some of them have never confronted a critical perspective in food. Right. Before they come into the classroom.
Yeah, so that diversity that attracts people to food is also the diversity that sometimes makes it challenging to have a common set of frameworks or languages or paradigms that help us express it in common ways, which is also fine, but it does set up challenges in the classroom.
Yes, that's what makes food studies very strong. But everybody has to learn how to think interdisciplinarily and open themselves up.
Yeah, and presumably take a leap of faith that pluralism and multiple perspectives are okay, even if they don't always seem to agree in sort of classic terms. Within this issue, as I mentioned, there's this incredible range of themes. And without saying pick your favorite child, was there one or another article in here that either surprised you because you weren't expecting it or delighted you because it articulated something that you were already thinking about?
Okay, so I'll give two answers. One, which I hope will endear myself to our gracious host here. The first that I think is really, really interesting is Phoebe Stevens and Lucy Hinton's article. And I like this one in particular because they kind of document the state of post-secondary food studies pedagogy in Canada. And part of what comes from that, kind of building on what Jennifer had just brought up, is that we don't actually have many food studies programs. Mm-hmm. In this country and really in North America. For those of us who hang around the Canadian Association for Food Studies, this is kind of it's a perennial conversation that many of us are sort of misfits and orphans in our respective institutions, finding homes where we can talk about food from various perspectives, from across the natural sciences to the humanities and social sciences. And so, that makes me feel that, it would be great if we had more food programs, because I think we are doing some incredible work from these kind of interdisciplinary vantage points, but to provide more deliberate and explicit food studies programming, I think could be really powerful in this country. So I think that's a really interesting one. And then the other one, David, I'll just say yours, the digesting performance piece. Okay,
that's what you mean by endearing yourself to the host. So yes, I did have an article in this collection, and I'm so embarrassed that it's being mentioned on the podcast.
So yeah, you're obviously better to speak to this, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but and I've mentioned this to you before as well, David, that I really just kind of admire your approach to kind of thinking about and teaching food. And this article is just it really sort of demonstrates your very creative approach to kind of thinking about food as a kind of material object.
Yeah, it was a very fun course I taught at Quest University, Canada many years ago, and it was all based in performance and the idea that food and performance are one thing, and that when you examine food through performance and performance through food, you get to some interesting, if not conclusions, some interesting questions. I was very happy to be able to have both taught the course and then get to write about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Jennifer, what about you? Any particular curiosities or conundrums that were raised in some of the articles in this issue?
Well, I want to echo Michael in mentioning your article because it is such an interesting way to learn about food. And in many ways, that kind of learning sticks much more strongly than, say, just being lectured at about food. So students really internalize the understandings that they've built through doing that kind of thing. So it really points to the importance, when you're thinking of the pedagogy of food, to the range of pedagogical approaches that people should be thinking about, and not just one way of teaching the course. The other thing, I was interested in the food literacy articles too, because there's such a very interesting tie between food pedagogy and food literacy as the sort of outcome of pedagogies and the general understandings of literacy, and moving that term out of language learning and into food learning. These kinds of articles really point to the sort of infinite number of ways you can pedagogically approach food.
Yeah, I think that is what comes across to me in this collection of articles, is how many approaches there are. Necessarily, if food is everything, then food pedagogy has to enable everything in the classroom.
Before we move on, maybe one other thing to just highlight, and this is an article per se, but the cover image, which was done by Lucy Godoy, who's now at George Brown College.
A beautiful rendering of the Rosie the Riveter We Can Do It image, but in chocolate.
Exactly. Right. I mean, and she was so generous to let us use it. I mean, this was created as an assignment in Jennifer's course. So Lucy was a student in that course and created this as her final project. And then, I mean, Jennifer, you can speak to this better than me, but, they actually broke this up and sort of ate it in her class, which is a really beautiful kind of thing to think about, right?
Digesting food pedagogy.
It was really a wonderful project that she did. Students have a final paper. It's a graduate class. But I found in the early years I was teaching that I was the only one reading their final papers, which were so interesting. So I thought we need to really share this knowledge around. So I made it as a requirement for the course that students had to make a poster of their final paper. And we spend 2 weeks doing poster presentations, and they get their 10 minutes of fame and talk to the rest of the students about their research for their final paper. And, everybody does a paper poster. And Lucy appeared with this framed, it looked like a photograph or a drawing, and it was about treatment of women chefs in Toronto restaurants. And so she gave her presentation, and students were very receptive to it. And then she turned the picture face down on the desk, took the back off it, and broke it all into pieces and said it's made of chocolate, and handed them out to people to eat. And the class went berserk. They couldn't believe it. And they're all lining up and they're eating it and they're talking. And
that's what I call embodied learning.
Yeah, exactly. And she gave me one as well. She made 2 of them. And it's hanging up on my wall. And I take it into class every year when I'm showing examples of how to make a poster.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, and Lucy is, of course, continuing on as the curator of the CAFS Exploration Gallery at the CAFS conference every year. And that is another way that knowledge gets transmitted, transferred, translated in all sorts of wonderful ways through food. Well, thank you both very, very much for this quick dip into the world of food pedagogies. I hope it will inspire our listeners to go and read some of these fantastic articles. And thank you both so much for continuing to expand our field and the ways that it can reach more and more students.
Of course, thanks for the invitation, and it's always a pleasure to sit and chat with you and Jennifer.
Yes, and thank you so much, David, for organizing all of this.
Pleasure. Thank you. Eric Schofield is both a teacher of and learner about food, instructing secondary school students in culinary arts while doing his graduate studies at Lakehead University. He's about to give us this episode's aftertaste, his take on the article Towards a Common Understanding of Food Literacy, written by Kimberley Hernandez, Doris Gillis, Kathleen Kevany, and Sara Kirk. It's one of the 16 pieces that make up the Pedagogies issue of Canadian Food Studies, so there's plenty more to read when you're done listening.
My name is Eric Schofield, and I'm a white settler living on so-called Vancouver Island, where I'm a culinary arts teacher at Stelly Secondary in Saanich School District, on the land of the Wasanich people. I am completing my Master's of Education at Lakehead University under the supervision of Dr. Charles Levko and Dr. Ellen Field, where I am looking at climate education and the role that food systems and food skilling has within that. I'm also a research assistant with the Common Ground Community Network, where I'm also helping to look at people in and the food systems. I read the article Toward a Common Understanding of Food Literacy, a Pedagogical Framework by Kimberley Hernandez, Doris Gillis, Kathleen Kevany, and Sara Kirk. This article was really enjoyable for me to read, looking back at the 12 plus years I've been researching and thinking about and applying food literacy in classrooms and teaching kitchens and doing presentations. And what really stood out for me is something that I've been grappling with this whole time is the importance of, moving beyond this idea of food literacy as a buzzword and looking at the various interpretations. So there can be, as this article says, a narrow interpretation which misses opportunities to accomplish what these researchers say is accomplishing or arriving at social change. I've often said food is an engagement agent, and food literacy is a nice pairing with that engagement agent. And so looking through this article, some of the things that I really enjoyed is the emphasis on social change. And it helped remind me of why I started exploring food literacy in the first place. And examples of this highlighted in the article are like the systems thinking and interdisciplinarity components, and also the ways of looking at food literacy as a dynamic term, and also how it affects health and the environment, people and climate and food, and all of these complex factors. I agree with their discovery that it's important to look at food literacy beyond a narrowly defined term, because there's so much opportunity for it to benefit the food systems themselves, food systems research, pedagogy, and people's interaction with food in the food system. And that can be food growers, and food harvesters, and consumers, and cookers, and bakers, and all these different facets. And finally, I'm not only intrigued, but heartened as a high school educator by the inclusion of appraise in the conceptual model. Because I've often told my students this thing called Google Now What, that they're overwhelmed with information. I, as a grad student, am overwhelmed with information. And so this idea of to really take it in and use different skills which exist within food literacy and components of how to look at it. So to summarize, I think this article is great for anybody to read, whether it's undergraduate students, high school students. I would even share this with some of my high school students, but also like grad students and then policymakers and food skilling practitioners, community groups, because it provides an overview of food literacy, and it also does it with a criticality that speaks to the importance of food literacy not being boxes to check, but lenses or paradigms or priorities or analogies, like just ways to look at food in the food system. Because yes, food literacy is a dynamic term, and our food system is dynamic, and food is dynamic, the weather is dynamic, it all is. And so I really think this article is hugely beneficial to anybody who is doing this research, but also anybody who's just kind of confused or curious about what's going on in the world of food and how people affect it and how it affects people. And the last thing I'll say is that food literacy is far beyond a buzzword, as I've mentioned already, and it's rooted in systems thinking and youth and community engagement and critical approaches to food and food system. And at this stage in my research, it has been nourishing and encouraging and inspirational to read.
And that wraps things up for now. I hope you're feeling learny, learned, and maybe learnful, or at least ready to go and eat some pedagogic chocolate. If you're an educator, maybe you can lobby your institution to create some food studies courses and build on this issue of Canadian food studies. Or better yet, start your own learning center about food. And while you're at it, plant an edible forest garden on top of the playground. My thanks to today's guests, Alexia Moyer, Jennifer Sumner, Michael Classens, and Eric Schofield. Our executive producers are Rachel Engler-Stringer, Laurence Godin, Charles Levko, Phil Loring, and Kristen Lowett. And I'm David Szanto. Take a look at the show notes for links to the Pedagogies issue of Canadian Food Studies and to the Canadian Association for Food Studies website. Then become part of the conversation on social media or submit a perspective or a field report to the journal. Pluralism is the name of the food studies game. And here's a challenge. Next time you're sitting around the dinner table or grabbing takeout from a food truck, think about the dozens of trajectories that those ingredients took to get to your hands and mouths, along with all the conversations, flirtations, and celebrations they might have participated in along the way. After all, humans aren't the only social creatures in the food web now, are they?